So welcome everyone to today's webinar about compounding pharmacies. If you're new to our webinars, welcome, and if you're returning to our webinars, we welcome you again. My name is Jason Kelly. I'm VP of Services at Lighthouse World Solutions, and I also have Peter McGuire.
Hi, I'm Peter McGuire. Pleasure to meet everybody out there in the big world of videos. Currently, I'm the Vice President of our PPE group. Previous to that, I was in systems and helped a lot of companies, everything from Bayer, Baxter, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, implement monitoring systems in their GMP facilities.
So, welcome, Peter. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to have you too, Jason.
Wealth of knowledge. Compounding pharmacies,
Near and dear to my heart, buddy. Near and dear to my heart. It's a market that's currently growing right now.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you look at what just happened with the pandemic, and the utilization of getting vaccines out through compounding facilities and so forth.
And then there's also the health and safety aspect of the product and the person in the compounding facility making those compounding pharmacies, their health and safety as well. So we kind of designed this webinar today because we had a lot of questions from the field about the compounding pharmacies, especially in relation to the updates, the recent updates, the USP updates. So I guess we'll get into it.
Oh, you've got some slides prepared, right?
So as I said, we've recently had a lot of questions from the field on compounding pharmacies with respect to updates and standards. So we decided to address some of these questions and have a dedicated webinar. And for those of you who have questions, please type them in. We're actually going to address those questions in a separate response at a future date. We'll let you know when. Obviously, we want to capture more questions from the field. So what is a compounding pharmacy? Well, a compounding pharmacy is a specific type of pharmacy. They make medications for people who have certain medication needs or requirements. Such medications that aren't mass-produced and available at a standard pharmacy. Compounding pharmacies can make two types of compounding products, sterile and non-sterile. Some pharmacies specialize in one type of compounding, whereas others may offer services for both.
So my understanding is a compounding lab, what they do is, let's say if I went to my doctor and they gave me a specific prescription, that wasn't something like Tylenol or aspirin that I couldn't get a generic drug on the store, I'd go to a compounding lab and give them my prescription and they would mix something up for me and provide.
Yes, or even if there's a drug that has not been continued, it's a discontinued drug, you can take that prescription, the compounding formula, and provide that to your compounding pharmacist.
Gotcha. And you were saying that there's sterile and non-sterile.
Yeah, there's two types of compounding pharmacies that we'll get into as we go through the next couple of slides.
Awesome. Looking forward to those slides.
Great.
What type of compounding medications are most at risk from contamination?
That's a good question.
Well, I would answer that question. Typically it depends on its mode of transmission into the body, right? So anything that you're injecting physically into the bloodstream needs to be sterile, right? Because that's when you're injecting into the bloodstream, you're actually bypassing a lot of your immune system. So things that go maybe into like orally, a little less intense from a manufacturing standpoint, right, or regulatory standpoint.
Yeah. And sterile compounds include dosage forms like injections, eye drops, and infusions. As Peter says, anything that bypasses your immune system needs to be sterile. Now, the Food and Drug Administration defines pharmacy compounding as the mixing, combining, or altering of active pharmaceutical ingredients to make a customized medication for an individual patient.
I'm not very patient.
So there's a lot of risks and consequences, and as highlighted, the main risk from compounding pharmacies is sterility of product and risk of death to patients. You can see that the FDA cracks down on rogue compounding facilities. In 2012, a New England compounding center was responsible for the 2012 nationwide fungal meningitis outbreak that killed 64 people and caused infections in 793 patients. In 2018, the pharmacist was sentenced to 8 years in prison for 77 counts of fraud and racketeering and dozens of unsuspecting patients died because of the tainted medications.
Right. My understanding is what happened is that they actually, and I don't know this for fact, I'm not an attorney, is they actually got greedy. So what they were doing is they were getting, so as we talked about earlier with Jason, as a compounding lab, I get a prescription from my doctor. I take that single prescription and I bring it to my compounding lab and they make that drug for me. My understanding is what they were doing is they were getting a whole bunch of prescriptions at the same time from a group of hospitals, and they were making almost like mass production of drugs in a single production facility. They didn't have their SOPs, the facility wasn't designed properly, and thus they started having problems.
Yeah.
They were having problems, but they liked the money that they were making because they were mass producing at a single production
Absolutely,
facility.
and there were shortcuts taken in the process. Processes that should have been in place to pick up failures in the contamination and the control of the product and the quality of the product. So as you can see, it's very critical in these compounding pharmacies that the proper processes are followed.
Amen.
So there are two, to answer your question, there are two general categories of compounding pharmacies, and these two categories exist because of legislation enhanced by the US government.
What are the differences between 503A and 503B compounding pharmacies?
503A compounding pharmacies. These pharmacies can compound medications based on a prescription from your healthcare provider, more or less non-sterile, whereas the 503B compounding pharmacies, these pharmacies too can compound medications on a prescription, but they also compound sterile medications in large amounts and sell them to healthcare locations such as hospitals or doctors' offices. And these are also sometimes called outsourcing facilities. In the USA, there are 56,000 community-based pharmacies in the US, and around 7,000 of these are 503B facilities, which require real-time monitoring of environmental monitoring data.
Seems like I remember correctly, it was somewhere after that New England issue where the president came in and enacted, they came up with 503A and 503B as a response to that New England event. So.
That was some new news to me, but I can imagine there was a huge outcry because of all the deaths and the shortcomings in the whole processes within that facility and contamination control and adherence to proper GMP.
How are compounding pharmacies categorized?
Well, there are a few regulating bodies and standards for compounding pharmacies. The US Pharmacopoeia Convention, the USP, is a private, non-profit body of about 300 delegates. The purpose of USP are to set standards for healthcare products in the US. The United States Pharmacopoeia sets standards for compounding which states or federal agencies may choose to enforce. The USP General Chapter on compounding are considered to be the gold standard and should be adhered to in all compounding pharmacies, even if your state has not adopted certain chapters. There are different standards for sterile, non-sterile, and hazardous drug compounding outlined in this slide, as you can see. Collectively, these USP General Chapters are a set of standards that assist healthcare practitioners with consistently producing quality compounded medicines to help ensure that patients receive medicines that are the right strength, quality, and free from contamination. Collectively, these USP General Chapters are a set of standards that assist healthcare practitioners in consistently producing quality compounded medicines to help ensure patients receive medicines that are the right strength, quality, and free of contamination.
We love free of contamination.
Oh yeah, since we are a contamination monitoring company.
That's right, that is what we do, isn't it? That is crazy. Yeah. We make particle counters, we make instrumentation. Wait, I was the VP of systems. We do monitoring systems. You're in charge of installing them now. Absolutely. We got a team. All right. That's what I'm talking about.
We also have PPE, which is there you go.
Which is a big part of this.
A one-stop shop.
Coming at you with PPE, baby.
How do technicians protect themselves from hazardous pharmaceuticals?
That's a great question. So, is everybody out there familiar with the word PPE? Do we know what that means, the audience?
personal protection equipment.
Right.
Oh.
Fantastic, right? Personal protection equipment isn't limited to just, let's say, healthcare or compounding, right? Personal protection equipment could be everything from, let's say you're going to do a home improvement project and you're going to paint a wall and you want to get a painter's mask so you're not damaging your lungs with contaminants and particulate in your house, right? That's PPE. You have a hard hat, that's PPE. In compounding, safety glasses is PPE.
Gloves.
Perfect, man. We're on a roll, baby. Gloves. We got gowns, right? We've got goggles. We've got hairnets. We've got booties.
Safety boots.
Yep. Safety boots, right? All PPE. Now, in compounding labs, right? What I'm used to would be things like I put a hairnet on, right? I don't want hair follicles shedding off, right? Everybody in the world knows that hair follicles are 50 to 90 microns in diameter, right? And I certainly don't want to take a compounding drug that's got a hair follicle in it. It just wouldn't bring a lot of confidence to me, you know what I mean? So PPE, I think, is designed to both protect the person, but in some sense, it's also protecting the product.
Like we could say that the PPE must be appropriate for the specific task being performed and must be worn and used and maintained in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions.
That is a great statement, Jason.
Thank you.
You've done that very well. So, typically PPE, let's say in a compounding facility, has to be governed by the compounding facility itself.
We also have the USP 800, the hazardous drugs handling and in healthcare settings, and it talks about PPE. Maybe you want to give us a bit more insight.
I can elaborate on that,
yeah.
Right? So in USP 800, there are certain, I want to say, recommendations or requirements around certain types of gloves that you have to use depending on the type of material, if you're handling a more hazardous type of material, if that material is actually exposed to the ambient environment. Some materials are in a container, they're not exposed, people aren't going to be exposed to them. So
yeah,
it's a lot of words of exposure.
And what about like face mask protection in particular?
Wow, good question. So face mask protection is something that's near and dear to my heart. When you start looking at respiratory protection, right, the basic level protection you can start with, let's say something like a surgical mask or a procedure mask, which the whole world, I think, these days, because of the pandemic, is familiar with surgical masks, with N95 masks and things like that, right? So in this particular setting, again, depending on the type of drug that you're manufacturing, you might want a little more or a little less protection, right? So you could just use a flat surgical mask. The problem with surgical masks are they leak, meaning they're really designed to make sure that either A, the person wearing them, let's say in a healthcare setting, if there's I'm cutting an artery and I don't want that blood splatter, right? So that's a good reason from a protection standpoint. Or let's say I cough and I don't want all of that particulate coming out of my mouth.
You're performing open heart surgery, it's not a good idea to cough over the open chest of the person.
I kind of agree with you. I feel like if I'm the guy on the table, I want my guy in a good N95 respirator, which would make from Lighthouse Worldwide Solutions. We'll give a little marketing push here for you. So flat surgical masks are a solution. They're good at blocking. Because of the pandemic, I think we're aware that, we talked about this 6-foot safety measure. Well, where that actually came from is they did studies where people were sneezing, and if you sneeze and you didn't have a mask on, that sneeze could go up to easily 12 feet, up to 20 feet away.
Even further, yeah.
It could even go further. With a mask on, what they found is that plume of particulate only traveled maybe up to 3 feet, maybe 4 feet. So they said, okay, if 2 people are sneezing and they're in masks and they're 6 feet apart, that gives them ample space that even if they're wearing a surgical mask, that particulate would come out and wouldn't travel that distance. So in the compounding facility, just depends again on what you're manufacturing. Now, for a little more protection, you could move to what we call an N95 respirator, right? N95 respirators are governed by an organization called NIOSH, which is under the CDC. And these respirators are designed to filter out at a minimum 95% of particulate, 0.3 micron and larger. But what people don't really know is actually they filter particles much smaller as well. We've done studies in our own masks, in our own development, where we're filtering particles. We're at 97% filtration efficiency at 25 nanometers, 0.025 micron.
That's pretty impressive.
it's pretty impressive. Engineering feat.
Yeah, so in a compounding pharmacy, when you're working with hazardous products, like the masks are there to protect, obviously eye goggles as well. And we'll get into it a little bit further in the slides. We're also going to look at some of the mini environments like the LAF cabinets and the BSCs that are used to protect the operator and the product, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on that. So overall, we can talk about the USP 800 standard provides a comprehensive set of guidelines for ensuring the safe handling of hazardous drugs in healthcare settings, but also to protect the operator as well. I remember, back in Australia, I used to go to certain companies and I'd be around products that were cytotoxic. And these products actually kill all types of cells. So I had to wear proper PPE and get tested. I had to do blood tests before and after entry into these facilities because, the risk of even getting some of that product in my eyes or, my skin or inhaling was very, very great. So you really need to consider the protection of the operator and the product and the quality and sterility of that product during the processes.
Jason brings up a great point about proper protection, right? So a lot of times where I see people missing proper protection is they may buy a mask, but they never fit test the mask. So how do you know if the mask actually seals on your face? How do you know that it's leaking? And this is where, like I've seen in the public, people just don't take fit testing seriously enough, and a lot of people don't understand fit testing.
As well, you see people wearing masks that have big beards like us, and I can imagine
doesn't work.
You're going to get a lot of leakage. So fit testing the mask to the person's face specifically gives that assurance that you're wearing the right type of mask, you got the right type of protection. How often are fit tests done?
So typically fit tests are required once a year by OSHA, and then during that year you're required to use that same mask.
And is that also applied to compounding pharmacies, that the staff would have to be tested?
In USP 800, and it states, I have some notes right here, fit test the respirator and train workers how to use respiratory protection. Yeah. So I'm going to lean towards yes.
And I wonder how many compounding pharmacies out there are actually following that guideline and getting their staff tested every year. And even if, I know some recommendations in fit testing, if you lose some weight or if there's changes in your face, that you need to get fit tested again.
Right. If you've lost weight, you've had structural changes in your face, maybe you've gotten in a car accident, you have a scar or something like that, then right, you need to get requalified on the mask. And as an end user, manufacturing products, manufacturing drugs and compounding, I want that protection.
Absolutely.
Right? I'm like, I see people put masks on, they're like, I don't care if it fits. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm 56 years old. You start caring about now. You don't care when you're in 20s and 30s. You actually start caring later in life and you go, that stuff's building up in my system. Oh, bummer.
Exactly. So, yep. We can't stress about the importance of having the proper protection in those types of facilities.
Absolutely.
Also, when touching on the regulations, there's also the USP 797 from the United States Pharmacopoeia. And in June 2019, they released several new and revised compounding standards. Specifically, USP published the final revised version of the general chapter of compounding of sterile preparations to accompany the previous released general chapter on the hazardous drugs handling in healthcare settings. For the aspects on environmental monitoring, according to USP 797, the facility, should be designed to demonstrate a suitable environment for aseptic compounding, with an electronic measurement of the data of the total number of airborne particles, with certification to ISO 5, 7, and 8 environments, using volumetric air sampling to monitor the viable microorganisms in the air, and also using settle plates and glove fingertip monitoring and surface sampling. So there's a lot of environmental monitoring in these facilities that you need to follow.
So you said there's standards. You said ISO 4, 5, and 6, or 5,
ISO
6, and
5, 7, 8.
So that you're talking about ISO 14644-1.
Absolutely. This is a standard that's used universally for clean room certification to certify that a certain facility or mini environment meets the criteria. For example, if you're preparing sterile solutions, you'd need to do that in an ISO 5 environment, so that you know that the level of contamination is at low risk of propagating into the product.
So the lower the ISO class, the cleaner the environment. So ISO class 9 is dirtier
dirty.
than 8, it's dirtier than 7,
yeah.
and it goes down to class 1, right?
Class 1, and these type of class clean rooms we see in the microelectronics industry.
Gotcha.
Whereas in the pharmaceutical industry, compounding, your lowest class would probably be around ISO 5.
Okay. Now, compounding, are these guys also are concerned with, so I know there's viable and non-viable particles. So you have living particles that are viable, and you have non-living particles that are non-viable. My understanding is electronics, they just care in particular, in general, whatever it is,
Yeah.
but in compounding, they really care about both, but the viable stuff is the stuff that...
The viable particles don't affect electronic circuitry. They're more concerned with what type of particles or what size particles are getting on in terms of the yield. So in those type of industries, it's all about yield. When we talk about healthcare, pharmaceutical industry, compounding industry, we talk about safety and quality of product.
Gotcha.
As we've seen in those previous slides, back in 2012, a lot of people died from contaminated product. So USP 797, it's enforceable. It's an enforceable standard which was developed by the United States Pharmacopoeia. And it helps the pharmaceutical compounding practitioners understand the fundamental accuracy and quality practices for preparing compounded sterile preparations.
Okay, that's good, that's helpful.
How are compounding pharmacies categorized?
Well, compounding pharmacies are categorized by low, medium, and high risk, depending on the nature of the compounding. For example, in low-risk environments, compounding takes place in an ISO 5 laminar flow hood or isolator inside an ISO 7 buffer area with an ISO 8 area for gowning. So in medium environments, the same environment requirements are as the low-risk compounding, but there are no exceptions for environmental conditions, and they require more frequent testing. The same for high level, we have the same environmental requirements, but we also have more testing of the environment in this area, in particular for sterility and for contamination. Risk. And obviously, you've got open vials or exposure of the product. We don't want any contamination getting into those products.
Makes sense.
So sterile compounding is defined as the combining, the mixing, the dilution, pooling, reconstitution of the product, like in some sort of WFI, the repackaging, or wherever you're altering a drug or bulk product substance to create a sterile preparation. That is what sterile compounding is about. And here are some of the regulatory agencies that enforce and regulate the compounding standards. We have this, obviously the FDA are involved. We have the CDC making recommendations, and then we have statewide compounding regulatory agencies. We have USP, and we've also got the National Association Boards of Pharmacy and Pharmacy Compounding Accreditation Board. These are just some of the examples that we have in the regulations that get enforced in compounding.
How does a 503B compounding pharmacy operate, and how is product sterility achieved?
That's a great question, and all compounding pharmacies consist of rooms that have specific purposes. Each room has to work together to provide the correct working conditions, both determined by code and by comfort for the staff. And the comfort aspect, obviously, we all need to be comfortable in the environment, but we don't want to have the temperature too high or the humidity too high. People get agitated in those gowning suits and they start to move around a lot more.
They can get hot.
It gets hot in there, and then that extra movement causes more particles to be dispersed into the room. Despite what you may think, these gowning suits, they don't keep all particles at bay from the clean room. So, in a typical pharmacy, there are like the working area inside the pharmacy. You've also got the ante-room. And then you've got for non-hazardous compounding, you'd have an ISO 7 room with a LAF cabinet or a BSC cabinet if you were going to go to that extreme. But for hazardous compounding facilities, you definitely would need to use a biological safety cabinet of a class 2 type. And we can actually start looking a bit more deeper at how these mini environments, these LAF cabinets and these biological safety cabinets protect product and personnel.
LAF stands for what? Laminar airflow?
Laminar airflow. Yep.
Okay.
So as you can see, as we go through these LAF cabinets, In compounding pharmacies where sterile and non-sterile products are made, obviously we use LAF and a combination of BSE cabinets, depending on the type of the compounding facility. For example, the 503A, you would probably use more LAF cabinets,
Right, that
whereas in
makes sense.
503B, where you have sterile compounding happening, biological safety cabinets are used. So how the LAF cabinet would operate, you have the obviously you filter. There's two types of LAF cabinets. You can have one with a horizontal flow, as seen here, and the one on the left. The LAF cabinet on the right gives you a vertical flow. You can see the clean air flowing down vertically, and then you can start to see the environmental air and the contaminated air mixing near where the operator would be working from. And as you can see in some of these applications, because of the nature of the product being compounded, there's no risk to the operator, so they don't have the PPE, they don't need it. Whereas if we look at a biological safety environment where you're working with hazardous compounding materials, you can see here you definitely need to be gowned up. And biological safety cabinets are enclosed workspaces with a ventilated hood that is designed to contain pathogenic microorganisms during the microbiological processes. And Class 2 biological safety cabinets take the level of protection up a notch from, let's say, LAF cabinets. And in some cases, the design can be quite complex. This class of cabinet has actually got subcategories of about 5 types, from A1, A2, B1, B2, and Class C. In the simplest terms, this class of cabinet offers the same protection as a Class 1 biological cabinet, but they also protect users carrying out microbiological work for sterile, pharmacy compounding. And again, the biological safety cabinets can be spec'd into a particular facility based on the application and the type of risk in that facility of exposure and the type of product that's being used as well.
I liked your example there of the 2 different PPEs based on the type of compounding they're doing, right?
Absolutely.
You can clearly see in that first picture that we showed that they were really just gowned down to their knees, and some things, some skin was exposed, where here they're really fully gowned. She's got a surgical grade mask on, I can see from the picture. And that's, there's obviously N95 to offer better respiratory protection, but that's a good start.
When I worked in a cytotoxic laboratory doing some service work on particle monitoring equipment, I had to get gowned up to those same specifications. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but at the same time, you have that knowledge that you're safe from the product.
Right.
Like, especially if the product can get aerosolized, get into your eyes, inhale it, you could have very detrimental consequences to your health later on.
And you bring up, that was a very good part where when people are thinking about PPE, you also have to take into account the vector, what we would call the vector of transmission. So is it an aerosol that could go into your lungs, or is it a physical liquid that you're probably not going to drink, right? So kind of common sense, but you can see how, depending on what you're working on, you're going to need different levels of protection.
Absolutely, and even if there's an accident where you got a liquid sterile product, like I said, like the cytotoxic, there's also the risk of breakage and splashes. So wearing the proper goggles is really important. As that was to go through your eyes, you'd probably end up blind or worse, in your
good
health.
point.
So as I said, biological safety cabinets are an essential part of biosafety, as they minimize the formulation of aerosol, protecting the environment and the pathogen and the laboratory personnel. Most BSCs are function to sterile biological materials that are kept inside the cabinets. And then we can go a step further and talk about PC4 containment facilities, where they keep and house samples of different types of viruses like Ebola or other,
Like BSL level 3
absolutely.
or something like
that's
that.
that's on a different level
Okay.
altogether. Like here with the compounding facilities, we have an example here of somebody actually compounding. I can see maybe a single sterile syringe being formulated. That could be just specifically for one patient.
What are those instruments in the background there? I see something that looks like a little silver cone in the background, and then this beautiful looking blue device. What are those?
They're your monitoring points, and it's really important that you are monitoring for non-viable particles. The cone that you see over on the left above the hand of the operator, that's monitoring the particles coming over the process. So
Gotcha.
So what we have here is the vertical HEPA filter, clean air passing down over
Coming down, okay.
that work environment, that critical zone. If we look at the best practices using a cabinet, we see that there's really 3 monitoring locations that I've outlined. We have settle plates, you've got your particle counter, and you have your air sampler. And I've numbered them here as we can follow through the best practice in the environmental monitoring inside these cabinets. And as we've seen, we've got sterile applications like cell and tissue, cytotoxic, working on tissue cultures, doing PCR studies or radiopharmaceuticals and hazardous type of materials. It's really important to understand where and how to monitor. As you can see here, the work zone there, we can see that the work zone, which is a yellow color there and transparent color inside the cabinet, that is where the compounding activities will take place. And it's important to understand you've got that clean air passing over the process. So you can see number 2 there, the particle counter. Its function is to make sure you have that clean air passing over the process.
That makes sense, because you want to make sure that the air coming out of the filter is unadulterated, it's clean.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And inside the biological safety cabinet, you're also developing positive pressure. And you got that small little barrier where the operator is working in that environment and doing the manipulations. That creates a nice barrier between the environment that they're working on, because you have just basically clean air being pushed out into that environment rather than dirty air finding its way into the biological safety cabinet.
So for those that are listening to this, positive pressure means you're forcing more air into the space, and so that clean air is coming out away from the product that's being manufactured and really kind of coming towards the operator, and you're keeping the operator contamination away from the product.
And here we see the placement of a particle counter probe above the process, and then you have the air sampling sample head down below the process. And the role of the air sampler is to actually monitor the process. So as you can imagine, you have an operator there doing the manipulations inside the cabinet. Sometimes the gloves may come apart from the gown and you may get skin exposed, and that's obviously detrimental to probably adding in contamination to the product. So the role of the air sampling device is to pull the air sample out of that work environment, as we can see this area here, and those particles, if they're present, once the Petri dish gets incubated, you can start to see if any CFUs, colony forming units, will form on the sample. And it's the best method, and it's really important to understand where to position your sample probes and why. And that's half the battle, because when I go and see some installations and the end user is not fully aware of how to use the equipment, they don't have them in the right place, so they're not getting real good data from their environmental monitoring.
So you're sort of saying it's one thing to have the proper instrumentation, but it's another thing to have them in the proper location.
Absolutely.
Because you could spend as much money as you want on this instrument, but if it's not sampling in the right location, it's not providing you valuable data.
Yes, and in today's standards, you have a risk assessment. I would definitely be encouraging compounding pharmacies to take on board these risk assessments, to work out their environmental monitoring plan and their contamination control strategy, and implement these into the design of the facility in terms of where you're going to locate and why. Obviously, we need to have a situation like what we see here on the slide, that you're monitoring that clean air passing over the process and you're monitoring the process itself.
Makes sense.
Here again, we have that slide. We take a closer look at the operator in the critical zone. And the critical zone is where the operator works within this BSC. The operator is filling a single dose syringe. We see that the non-viable monitoring in location number 2 is being performed. And then you've also got the viable monitoring in location 3. And I wonder if anybody can pick out what we're missing. We're missing one other part of monitoring on this particular image.
Let's see, we've got particulate, we've got viable. I mean, it could be temperature, humidity. It could be an option.
True. The third one there would be a settle plate as well.
Ah, okay. So you want to do a settle plate in addition to the active viable sample.
The objective of the settle plate is to capture those particles that will fall, the heavier particles that will fall onto surfaces.
Gotcha.
You'll also get those particles that will, take some time to fall onto surfaces. So that's why we have the volumetric impaction method using the air samplers, as you see in number 3 here on the slide.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
What monitoring products and technology would you recommend in a 503A and 503B compounding facility?
Well, for a 503A, I'd recommend, obviously portable air samplers and particle counters, and you do have your settle plates as well. These instruments will cover the basic monitoring requirements in the 503A. For 503B, depending on the size of the facility, continuous monitoring systems would be the best automated option. These systems will automatically collect your data, notify operators of out of specification trends on the data that can potentially impact on product and safety quality. So these systems are really important, and they will send notifications to the operators or to managers that you do have an event, that you're outside of your specifications for your alarm limits, for particle concentrations, that they can take immediate action and maybe halt the process and do a root cause investigation. Peter, what are your thoughts on these
I
systems?
was sort of reflecting back first on the viable, then I'll get to the systems. We had several customers in our history that went from settling plates and moved to what we would call more active sampling. And the reason was it was repeatable. They could get the same volume of air every time, and then over time that data just becomes a trend of like, okay, well, I can see if I did this, I got this data. Where a settling plate, you've got a fixed airflow that's coming down, but it can vary if an operator gets in the way, right? So we had a lot of accounts move to more active air sampling with integrated pumps.
Absolutely, yeah.
From a monitoring standpoint, I'm a big proponent, obviously, of real-time monitoring. It takes some of the guesswork away from what's happening in the environment during manufacturing, because a lot of times what we have found is that when they took a portable particle counter in there, it's not during manufacturing. They're sort of qualifying the space, assuming the space is still good, and then moving manufacturing in. But when you're looking at it, really monitoring real time makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and that comes back to this compounding issue that will happen in 2012. And if that company had been implementing these types of methods, then we would have definitely a different outcome. Right. Unfortunately, this is hindsight, but I just want to make awareness of the importance of monitoring inside your compounding facilities and the PPE that's involved for the protection of the personnel working in these environments.
Right. I've heard a lot of customers, I don't want to say customers, that's not fair, a lot of people talk about, well, we don't need this, we've never had a problem. Well, there's a lot of things that we've never had a problem with. We used to have a World Trade Center before 9/11, right? We never thought that was going to happen. So there are issues that do occur, and the whole point well, not the whole point, but part of SOPs and GMP is to make sure that we're putting barriers in place so that those issues don't happen.
Absolutely.
And that's when you talk about risk assessment.
And as well, the overall objective is the patient. At the end of the day, it's critical that the end users of these medications receive the highest quality and safest products. Their lives may depend on it. For those of you, undergoing operations yourself, you want to know, that the product that you're going to take post, like if you're having an open heart surgery, obviously your immune system is really compromised,
right.
And you're going to be taking some products post operation. You want to be ensured that those products are safe and effective.
100%, right? I think we lose track of the fact that we're dealing with human life. And so what's that cost relative to installing a particle counter or doing an extra sample? Seems sort of ridiculous when you get to that level.
Absolutely. So I'd like to say we're just approaching the end of today's webinar, and for those of you with questions, please type them in and we'll definitely get back to you. As I said, we're going to design a response webinar on the questions. We're really looking forward to see the input from the field today. Other than that, we hope you found this webinar informative, and I'd like to say please share it with your colleagues. And in closing, for more informative information, we do have a knowledge center on our website. And it's got a library of topics covering past webinars, environmental monitoring standards, best practices, equipment training, application overviews. So it's got all the detail. There's the website there. It's www.golighthouse.com. And you'll find within the Knowledge Center, when you click on a tab, you'll have free access to great knowledge content. We also have next to our Knowledge Center information on PPE and N95 masks, and there's even some nice videos on how to wear them, etc. Again, putting the mask on properly. So I'd like to say thank you, Peter.
Oh, no, thank you,
been,
Jason. It's always a
great-
pleasure to see you. And
See you, my friend.
I respect you tremendously for the knowledge that you bring to the table, and it's always great to team up on these things.
And
So,
likewise, it's been a long time since we've had you around in
Yep.
this area.
long time since our travels together.
Absolutely.
So-
I'd like to say thanks for the questions during the webinar as well.
Yep.
So stay safe, everybody, and keep protected. And we look forward to catching up on next month's webinar.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
So for those of you that are looking for PPE samples, specifically N95 respirators, if you go to the chat, you'll find that information and you can request samples.